In this video, we are going to see each of our advices individually. I'm using the same application as that of the one which we used in chapter 2 of this playlist. In addition to these two libraries, what I'm doing is I'm adding DevTools as well. I want to make sure that the application restarts every time I make some changes in the Java file and avoid restarting the server again and again. And apart from that, here in our aspect class, what we are doing, we are commenting these two annotations to make sure that none of the advice is being executed from this class. And we have created separate class with aspect and component annotation, and we'll be playing around advices in this class. And just to make sure that this specific advice is being called, we just added new to it. And we will be using these two APIs, creating an order and fetching the order, and we will refer these methods as business logic methods hereafter. Let me start the server for the first time, and we'll try to create an order. So if we see here from the logs, it gives a sense that this specific advice is executed. Now, having this response is of limited use. In a sense, even if I try to get some data like this, so it's going to print the same message, and we do not know which specific business logic is executed here. For that, what we can do is, as a first parameter to any of our advice, we can add join point. And this join point will have some of the information, and from that we can fetch our business logic method information as well. Here what I'm doing is I'm fetching the signature from the join point, and from that declaring type name. This declaring type name will have a fully qualified name of the class along with its package information. Get name will give us the actual method name which is being executed. Save. And if we create, here you will see it says place order method has been invoked, and if we try to fetch, then you'll see get order method from the customer order controller is invoked or executed. Now let us try to see if we can return anything from this method. We are trying to see if we can return from the before advice itself and do not go to the business logic. Save. It still executes the business logic, which means irrespective of whatever we return from this advice, the return from the specific advice method is ignored. We saw in our previous video that the invoke method of method before advice interceptor is called for before advice to invoke the before advice. And if you see the invoke method here, this method is responsible for a call to our advice which we have written here. And if you see, it is just ignoring the return from this method. And instead, whatever has been returned from the business logic at the end will be the return from the invoke method that is being considered. And that's the reason no matter what we return from this method, it is ignored. So it's better to just put void. But can we avoid invocation of business logic in the before advice? Yes, we can if we have some exception. Let's say this method throws exception. What we are doing here is we are trying to fetch the order incoming object from our join point and check if there are some items. If there is no item, then we'll just throw an exception from here itself instead of sending it to the business logic. Let's save. And what I'm going to do is we need empty items. Send. So we got an exception here. And if you see, no items found in the order in a sense. So from here itself it has been returned, and also we can see here there is no business logic executing. This means we can use before advice for validation as well. Let us now look into the after returning advice. I have just commented our before advice, and if you see here, even in the after returning, we can have the join point as discussed. Let me save this. Execute. You'll see the same thing happens even in the after returning advice. Now we know that after returning is executed after the business logic execution and in case of success only. If we get some exception, then after returning is not going to be executed, which means we can have the return object whenever we have the after returning advice. Can we return from here? Let's see. Let me just put the same thing, save, and it is still not useful. In essence, no matter which advice we are executing, the return value from them is just ignored. And that can be observed in the after returning advice interceptor. From our previous video, we know that the invoke method of this class is being executed. And here, if you see, once the return from the business logic takes place, advice method which we have implemented will be called, and the return from this method is just ignored. So that's the reason whatever we return from here doesn't work. But we can still get the return value of our object and tweak that value here. Let's give the property name value equals for our point cut information and comma. There is a property called returning and we are just naming it as order. As another parameter for this advice method, we can use order. Let's just print order.getId to see if the order which we are going to fetch here is from the business logic. Save, create an order. If you see, we do not send any of the ID from here, but the ID one is printed. In a sense, we are getting the order object. And also what we can do, order dot, let's say set items null, save. If you see, now the items are null, although we are sending the items, but the object returned doesn't have any items, and that's because we are able to tweak the returned object from the business logic. Just remove this part. Now what I'm going to do is I'll just name this as ord. Save and see if this order is still pointing to the business logic response. Here from the response we know that the order object which we received is still pointing to the response sent from our business logic method, which means irrespective of what name you give to your returning property, the matching to your order takes place or your response takes place based on the type of the object. Now here we have the order object, and that's the reason it is able to map your order object irrespective of the naming convention or the name used here. If I change this to object and try to see if this is still being matched or mapped, save. execute, you'll see that the object variable here, order, is still matching or mapping to the response from our business logic. The reason being, order is an object and from the hierarchy, it tries to match the type of the object. If this matches, then we are going to get our response. In contrast, if I change this to order, let me just remove this part and save, you'll see that an exception has occurred. And the reason being, Spring application is unable to make a decision between this object and this object because both of the type matches for this returning. In a sense, order is an object and order is an order. If you see the response, it is saying it's unable to bind because there are two candidates for binding. And that's the reason whenever you have some returning value, you must always have the highest order type over here. Let's just keep our order object. And another thing here is if I make my order or the returning variable as the first variable and join point as the second, it will still not work. Let's see, save. It says it is unable to create the bean itself because these types are not matching. The join point, if we have more than one parameter in our advice method, the join point should be the first parameter. Save. Now it's going to work. See, what if I do not set this property? Let me just remove, save. So application starts, but when we execute, only the business logic is being executed. And the advice which we defined here doesn't match at all because it needs the order parameter, but after returning is unable to match to any of the property because there is no returning variable here. Save. Now it works. I have just commented the after returning and after throwing. Same rule applies to after throwing advice as well. The first parameter can be a join point. Save. Let's just see. It's not called because this did not throw any exception. Execute, error, and here you see after throwing advice blah 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 is executed. And the same rule applies to this as well. We cannot return anything from this method. Even if we return, it is just ignored. That we can see in the invoke method of aspect J after throwing advice. So we see here in the invoke method, try, and in the catch block, we are trying to invoke our method, and this method is ignoring the return value. One thing to note here is whenever this invoke advice method is called, it is sending the join point. This is the return type and this is the exception. If we go over here, you see we have join point, return value, and third parameter is throwable. Whenever the aspect J after throwing advice invokes this method, it sends the exception because we have an exception. And in case of after returning, let me show that as well. Here in the after returning, if we go to this method, internally this method invokes the same method which we saw in the after throwing here. In after throwing, it is passing the exception, but in after returning, it is passing the return value. And that's the reason we were able to access the return value object. And in after throwing, we will be able to get the exception. We'll do the similar thing, comma, and this will have throwing. Throwing equals EX, and if I try to get exception, as we know, it doesn't make any difference what name we give, only the type of the throwing should match. Here, throwing exception is generic, and that's the reason in any case this method or our advice will be executed. Get the message. Let's save. And if we execute this exception here in our advice, it prints that no value present, and same thing you will see in the exception. And here in the logs you see that no such element exception is being thrown. Let's change it to no such element exception and save. Execute. So our advice method is executed. What if I change this type to maybe no such field error? Save. Execute. Here you see only the business logic is getting executed and our advice is just ignored. This is because this throwing will try to match the type of the exception, and since exception was generic and also no such element exception was specific, in both the cases we were able to execute our advice. Yes, in this case as well you can throw from here and cannot return anything, as we know. Even in after finally advice, we can have join point as the first parameter for our method. Save. If an exception occurs, our advice executes. If there is no exception, our advice still executes, because irrespective of there is a success or failure, after finally or after advice will be executed. And the same thing even here as well, you cannot return anything. Even if you return something from here, it is just ignored. And that can be seen in the invoke method of aspect j after advice. Here if you see in the finally block, it is trying to call the invoke method, which in turn internally calls the advice method which we have implemented here. And the return from that is just ignored. Note that this method is same as that of the previous two cases which we saw, after throwing and after returning. In after returning, the return value was sent. In after throwing, the exception was sent. Here we do not have the return value as well as the exception, and that's the reason our finally advice doesn't have any information of return or the exception. And these were some of the features of each of these individual advices. In our next video, we will see the around advice in detail. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.